Welcome to Alamein to Zem Zem, Keith Douglas's powerful account of his experiences in World War II. This book isn't just about battles, it's a deeply personal story of what it's like to live and fight in a world torn apart by war. With vivid descriptions and honest reflections, Douglas takes us from the Battle of Alamein across North Africa, sharing moments of chaos, courage, and humanity. This is more than a war memoir, it's a journey into the heart of what it means to be a soldier. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider subscribing. These are his words. Let's begin. I was not much disappointed by this news, and looked forward to seeing the desert in panorama from the back of a transporter. Everyone said that the country near Benghazi was green and beautiful, and I was curious to see the places whose names had been familiar to me before I left England. I also thought of the opportunities there would be to get more loot. We had all seen the enemy so disorganized that it did not seem possible he could regroup enough to give us much trouble. When we heard of the North African landings, very few people expected more than a few weeks of mopping up before the African campaign ended. We went forward without any idea of what was still in store for us. When the realization came, it broke very slowly, and was cruelly emphasized and re-emphasized. The transporters arrived, one by one, clanking down the road all day and most of the night. They make the sort of noise one would expect a Vulcan in his forge. It seems too loud to be produced by mortals and terrestrial metals. We did not much look forward to the job of loading the tanks and getting away. Edward, after valiant efforts to overcome an attack of dysentery, had gone into hospital somewhere in the Delta, looking very ill indeed, and Tom, still a lieutenant, was acting squadron leader. We had two new officers in the squadron, Billy, who had been one of the reservist non-commissioned officers posted to the regiment, a little dark man with a humorous face and deep lines, almost like scars, around his mouth, and his complete antithesis, Alistair McCunn, a young, smooth-faced amateur fisherman, apt not to speak and to sit about as though he still held a rod. His very appearance was a little like the god of fish described by Rupert Brooke, squamous, omnipotent, and kind, if the first adjective may be understood as piscine rather than scaly. To these new officers we allotted troops. The whole squadron was rationed and drawn up in formations that would get them onto the transporters in the minimum of time. But we knew we had little chance of a smooth working organization. To begin with, the colonel had put in charge of the transporter party the squadron leader of B Squadron, known to the troops as Sweeney Todd, from his habit of frowning and glaring at everyone, usually without noticing them. Hearing of this choice, Tom said, "We'll have plenty to do, straightening things out when old Sweeney gets hold of those transporter boys." For Sweeney is the true bull in a china shop, tactless, good-hearted, and perfectly unimaginative. He could infuriate more people in less time than anyone else I know, all without the least ill will toward them and without a suspicion that all is not well. His lack of imagination makes him shyer than the most sensitive youth, the converse of the man who didn't know much about art. Sweeney likes what he knows and distrusts what does not come within the range of his experience. Some of the men, who have not much imagination themselves, dislike him and hold old grievances against him because they have never understood his one complete and unselfish sincerity, devotion to the regiment. His upbringing as a member of the English upper class seems to have been rigidly typical, leaving him with fixed, inherited views on life. But if he has the faults of his type, he has its virtues, the famous English virtues of tradition. He is a man who might have stepped from the pages of Blackwood's magazine or Country Life. He could tell you how to use an axe or a gun, could discuss crops, blood sports, or livestock by the hour, and has a great love for the English countryside. His favorite reading, I believe, is adventure stories and the historical plays of Shakespeare. He mistrusts jokes, too many of which he does not understand. When someone makes a humorous remark which escapes him, he looks as unhappy as a large dog who is being laughed at. He enjoyed very much being placed in charge of men, and I believe he experienced the same sort of pleasure as a small boy who sets out lead soldiers, altering and replacing them exactly in the order he wants. He is afraid of intellectual conversation, of music, and of painting. This was the man Piccadilly Jim had put in charge of the transporter party. In fact, he had nothing to do but tell the RASC officers the numbers of tanks to be loaded, see that the tanks were available, and leave them to regulate the whole journey, since the tanks and their crews would merely be loads for the transporters. The RASC had never heard of the subformations of troop, squadron, etc., and were, quite properly, not concerned with them. There was absolutely no defensible reason why the loaded tanks should travel by troops. If they were unloaded anywhere, they could assemble in troops within 5 minutes. If they were to be loaded by troops, The whole system of drawing up transporters must be altered, and all these huge, unwieldy vehicles moved into a fresh order in the short time before darkness, for we were to start before dawn. Breakdowns on the road would inevitably alter the order again completely. But Sweeney insisted that the transporters must be arranged in the order of troops of tanks. He, and we, by his instruction, ordered the transporters to move. When they began to move, their own officers and NCOS, who had not been consulted, ordered them to go back to where they had started. In no time at all, a great muddle had been created, the rows of transporters were disorganized, and 2 crusaders, in attempts to load them, had snapped their tracks. Into the melee rushed a scout car, in which Piccadilly Jim stood, furiously rating everyone who came near him. Of course, he found one of the tanks with a broken track but could not find Tom, and eventually discovered me, and ordered me to put an NCO, who had nothing to do with it, on a charge. Tom and I conspired to forget to do this. The task of loading a Crusader tank onto the comparatively narrow trailer of a Diamond T transporter, even in daylight, is formidable. 2 ramps, weighty triangular lumps, are rolled over the end of the trailer and fixed in position, making a short, steep incline by which the tank is to mount the transporter. Up these ramps, with perhaps an 8-inch margin of error, the Crusader had to be driven. The tank was lined up and gingerly approached the transporter. The whole incident was like the mating of 2 immense creatures, mythical and prehistoric, as we saw it in the fading light. The bows of the tank approached the ramps, the tracks, for a wonder, were opposite to them, and it began to move upwards, rearing ponderously. But the driver had misjudged the steepness of the ramps, the tank rolled back and bumped onto the ground, refusing. The second attempt, a rush, carried it full onto the back of the transporter. As the rear road wheels, churning inside the belt of the track, came upon the ramps, the fore end of the tank reared fearsomely in the air, a great shape black against the faintly yellow west. It hung for a moment, as though the 18 tons of it would turn full over backward, and then crashed down onto the platform. The suspension softened its fall as pastons soften the fall of a rearing horse. It would take a half-hour more to secure it firmly against the jolts of the journey. We sat down at a table set in the moonlight to our last comfortable supper, and before going to bed, finished the last of our Canadian whiskey. Ken Tinker, the RHA observation officer who had been up to dinner with us nearly every evening since we got back to Mercer, had gone back to Cairo with his unit. Tom said, "I hate going without old Ken. The old lad won't know what to do with himself in Cairo." He always larded his conversation with these hearty phrases: everyone was an old lad, or a good little chap. Raoul was the only exception. Tom hated him and did not trouble to conceal this. We started 2 or 3 hours before dawn, trailing down the road with a rhythmic clanking that became a great strain on our nerves before the end of the journey. Among the loot remaining to me was a German inflatable rubber mattress, so far unpunctured. I arranged this with my bedding on the engine plates at the back of my tank, above the multiple rear wheels of the transporter, and since the road was reasonably smooth, slept comfortably on until 8 o'clock. I uncovered one eye at about 5 minutes past 8 and found the air warm, the sun already risen. So I lay and watched the desert go past until we halted for breakfast. The side of the road was still littered with derelict vehicles of all kinds, interspersed with neat graves bearing crosses inscribed with the names and rank of German officers and men, and surmounted by their eagle-stamped steel helmets. More hastily dug and marked graves were those of Italians, on some of which was placed or hung the ugly, green-lined Italian tope. There is something impressive in the hanging steel helmet that links those dead with knights buried under their shields and weapons. But how pathetically logical and human, one of those touches of unconscious comedy which makes it difficult to be angry with them, that the Italians should have supplemented the steel cap with a ridiculous, battered cut-price tope. The steel helmet is an impressive tombstone, and is its own epitaph, but the cardboard tope seemed only to say there is some junk buried here, and we may as well leave a piece of rubbish to mark the spot. Perhaps this epitaph strikes nearer the heart of those who read it. As the day waned, the road worsened, and I began to suspect more and more that the trailers of transporters were springless, as indeed they are. My pneumatic mattress flung me higher and higher in the air. As I bounced, I clung desperately to its edges. The next day, I transferred to the back of the towing lorry, which had springs. Whether it was Sweeney's fault or that of the RASC officers, we had fewer and fewer halts, until there was never time for more than 1 cup of tea a day. The tank crews became unnecessarily bored and dirty. Yet when we did halt, we wasted enough time to have had 3 halts a day, in moving the transporters round and round, altering their order to suit first Sweeney and then the RASC Sergeant Major. In no time, Sweeney and the RASC were hopelessly divorced from each other. Sweeney, I think, instinctively disapproved of officers who could not speak the King's English and were dirty in a back area, and they were not regimental soldiers. The RASC major naturally resented interference with his job, washing his hands of everything, and saying, "Okay, if your major wants to run it, let him. If he thinks he knows more about running a transporter convoy than we do, we don't mind." A direct result of this was that we had to do the night guards which, if Sweeney had let well alone, would have been found from the RASC spare drivers. Near Tobruk, which to my great disappointment we bypassed, we were met by the Colonel's party, and encountered another stupid situation. Billy Loxley, who had just joined a squadron as a newly commissioned subaltern, he had been a sergeant in C Squadron, had been sent with the Colonel's party, in charge of a squadron lorries. He was supposed to have gone in a jeep, but at the last moment Andrew had claimed the jeep, with a long tale about needing it as second in command of the road column. Tom and I were fed up because we supposed the real reason was that Andrew was one of the boys, the original pre-war yeomanry officers, and did not want the discomfort of riding on a transporter with his tank. This left us no other vehicle for Billy but the scout car, which had been ordered to go with the tanks. The whole thing was arranged at the last moment, and Billy had gone in the scout car. The next morning, Billy found that the colonel and the other officers had arranged a mess and were eating together. They had not bothered to tell him, and being very shy, he ate his meals with the men on his vehicles. Presently, Piccadilly Jim shouted for him. Billy went across and saluted. The following conversation took place. "Good morning, Billy." "Good morning, sir. Do you know smoothly and a little too politely, whose scout car this is?" "Yes, sir." "It's mine." "Oh no," said Piccadilly Jim. "It's not yours. A squadron didn't send a scout car." Billy was nonplussed, but he tried again. "I was given orders to come in this scout car, sir." "Oh no you weren't," said Piccadilly Jim. He then let loose a tirade on Billy, who had only acted on Tom's instructions, ending, "And when I give you an order, bloody well do what you're told." No one could be more offensive than Piccadilly Jim when he tried. Billy, who was an NCO, had always been efficient, and not particularly imaginative, had not had much contact with Piccadilly Jim, but he would have understood the reason for this arbitrary behavior, or been mollified by it, if someone had explained it to him. Instead, he was struck by the complete injustice of it and lost his temper. He answered back. Piccadilly Jim, who, to do him justice, usually knew when he had gone too far in one of his temperamental displays, tried to make up for it by inviting Billy up to take his meals with the others. But Billy was now thoroughly sulky and refused to come. So Tom was sent for and ordered to take Billy with him and send me. He managed to smooth things over after talking all afternoon, and Billy stayed. Tom came back in a bad temper. He had slight dysentery and had wanted to rest during the halt. At length, we clattered onto the road again and began to move on, out of the desert into a green country, out of Libya into Cyrenaica, past white schools and government offices and the notices of erstwhile German and Italian parks, water points, and hospitals. Across the signpost of a hospital, a board was nailed, "Under new management." Stenciled on the cracked plaster of outer walls and villas were bombastic Italian slogans, "W il Duce, W il Re. Vinceremo, Duce, Vinceremo, and a valedictory ritorneremo." The buildings were inviting, with cool, spacious courtyards enclosed by rooms and cloisters. We halted some 20 miles short of Bache for the night, among trees and green slopes where empty champagne and Chianti bottles lay in profusion among chocolate packets and cherry tins. On the bumpiest stretches of road, we had lost some of our water cans, and unfortunately, the full ones, and it looked as if we would have to forego our tea, because there was no water point within miles. I went up to the front of the column to see Tom about it, and as I came back again empty-handed, was met by one of my crew, who said, "There's a Yank down the road asking for you, sir." It was Paul Rainier, an American field service driver whom I had met in a dust storm on the Cairo-Alex road. That time, we were stranded without hope of getting back to camp. Sheets of rain had followed the dust storm, and we had no coats or bedding. We had slept in Paul's ambulance, and he had given us some real Scotch whiskey and lent my sergeant and me dry clothes and a book, of which he said enthusiastically, "You'll like this, Lieutenant. It's very risque." The whiskey was a solitary bottle, given him by his fiancée, to be opened only for a special occasion. We drank half of it, saving ourselves from being soaked and chilled. Here was Paul again, on a return run to Bache. He said he was living on chicken and wine there and willingly gave us all his water, 12 gallons, and all the vehicle rations from the ambulance, several tins of bully beef. I spent the night in the ambulance again, and we drank the rest of his whiskey, which he had preserved since our last meeting. My crew provided him and his friend in the next ambulance with a hot meal. We sat up fairly late in one of the ambulances over the whiskey and some gin which I was able to provide. Paul came from Boston and knew the only two other Americans with whom I was acquainted. At this time, the American Field Service were the only Americans we had come across in the Middle East, although that morning, a fleet of jeeps and lorries bearing the White Star had passed us. I asked Paul who they were. The U.S. Army Air Corps, he said. Before we went to sleep, Paul gave me a glowing account of American women, whom he said were the most beautiful and intelligent in the world. He invited me, rather speciously, to come to America after the war and meet hundreds of them, thousands of them. Lulled by this rosy prospect, I fell asleep. In the morning, the two ambulances were on their way an hour before we moved. Paul left me a blanket to replace the one I had lost the previous night, when, after befriending a stray dog and giving it supper, I was foolish enough to allow it to sleep on top of the tank. The bully beef had not agreed with it, and, being unable to jump down in the dark, it had made an irreparable mess of one blanket. Bache is a beautiful town. Its predominating colors are white, red, for roofs, and the deep green of trees. A few of the houses had civilians scrawled on them, and women and children like the peasants I had seen in Italy, carpet slippers and all, waved to us out of a welter of chickens and goats in their back gardens. They all seemed pretty happy. The town was more or less intact, although a bridge on the spiral mountain road leading to it was blown, and a 3-ton Chevrolet surcharged with German crosses lay upside down at the bottom of the hole. Near here, 5 camels had evidently wandered onto some mines on the verge of the road. An RAF lorry crew were cooking their supper a few yards away, across the road, the wind blowing away from them. The blackened, evil-smelling carcasses, almost reduced to bones and skin, lay where they had fallen. Before we reached Bache, we had begun to be approached by Senussi shepherds, who gave us fascist salutes and wished to sell us eggs. But although 100 lira of the money taken from prisoners would buy a chicken in Bache, the desert Senussi were not interested in money. The Germans had issued them a photographic replica of an English pound note, on the back of which some Arabic writing announced something. We could not read it, and 2 theories were put forward, either that it was to tell the natives we would redeem these for cash when we came, or that we would give them money as worthless as that paper. Whatever it said, they wanted none of our money, only sugar or tea would content them. Of these we had less than enough, but we persuaded some of them to take biscuits or bully beef. At first, we offered them some of our own brews of tea, but they would not drink it, or, if they did, made wry faces and spat it out again. They make a thick black syrup from tea and sugar, quite unlike our tea. Some of the troops defrauded them with tins of sand topped up with sugar, but the Senussi were not often simple enough to fall for that, and were never deceived by attempts to sell them dried tea leaves already used. Although we had missed seeing Tobruk, we were allowed a glimpse of Benghazi across the lake as we skirted it. At that distance, the damage to buildings was not visible. It is always astonishing to me how close you can get to a town which has been completely gutted, before it begins to look like a ruin. We saw only the Arabian beauty of white, square buildings, the squat domes, and the slender fingers of minarets and towers. The whole city had the appearance of a mirage. We drove now through an avenue of dusty trees and hedges in a monotonous, lazy sunlight relieved by the shadow and play of leaves, past a prisoner of war cage made by the Italians, and past the villas on the outskirts with their cool, walled gardens. Soon on either side, we saw in clusters the immense carcasses of troop-carrying planes and heavy bombers, noseless, wingless, crumpled, or surprisingly intact. Huge engines and great bombs lay about, and smaller debris. Our destination was now declared to be El Maghrem, 50 or 60 miles west of Benghazi. It seemed strange to be told that the enemy had turned to face us again, while we waited for the chain of supply to catch up with us. They were occupying positions lying inland from Mersa Brega, in front of Agala, where the road winds through impassable marshes, a narrow, easily defensible gap. When we reached Maghrem, however, we were ordered to move on to Ajdabiya, and as we wound our way along the road, on either side of which the green had given way again to hard sand and camelthorn tufts, we were suddenly halted and ordered to dismount where we were. We had been 10 days on the transporters, and I knew this would be long enough for the Crusader tracks to have loosened. I told Moody to tighten his tracks before he slid the tank down onto the road. He stoutly maintained it was unnecessary. Presently, I was called away by Tom, and came back to find another dispatch rider ordering my crew to lash the tank again and go on. This would have taken too long, so I told them to carry on as if the first order still held. Several tanks of the squadron were already on the road. I had seen Piccadilly Jim go by a moment before and felt sure these orders and counter-orders emanated from him, in one of his Queen Bess moods, when he would fling about like a temperamental woman and snap out so many incredible contradictions that the only thing to do was ignore them all and do what seemed best. As the tank slid down onto the road, I watched it come safely to the ground, then ran back down the line to see if I could locate the rest of my troop. To my horror, as I was walking back, I saw my own tank moving, turning diagonally toward a steep incline at the edge of the road. I was just able to spring onto the back of it as it plunged sideways into the loose sand, cutting a chunk out of the tarmac edge, but the engine drowned my impotent shouts. One track, bearing for a moment the whole weight of the tank while the other churned wildly in the air, snapped and stretched out behind. It would take about 2 hours to mend. I discovered that Moody had received a third order from a third dispatch rider, to get off the road quickly, and, in a not unreasonable resentment at the stream of contradictory instructions, had driven off sideways without tightening his tracks or getting anyone outside the tank to guide them. It was most unfortunate that it happened while I was away, but now the harm was done. I contented myself with giving him a rocket, and told them to hurry up and mend the tank. No great harm would have been done if we could keep the incident unnoticed by Piccadilly Jim. But Piccadilly Jim arrived 2 minutes later, and with one glance at the damning traces of the tank's departure from the road, turned on me the full force of an MP's eloquence. He would not allow a word of explanation, but shouted, in a voice audible to every driver and corporal within 50 yards. "You are a most inefficient young officer. I couldn't be more angry with you. I would willingly kill you at this moment. Buggering up the only road we've got for the whole army. Driving your tank off the road at a totally crazy angle. If you were an NCO, I assure you I should break you for this. If you were a lance corporal, I should take your stripe away. Of all the bloody incompetent idiots I ever met, you're the worst. You can consider yourself under open arrest." Moody and Corporal Sandring were paying great attention to mending the track. Piccadilly Jim strode away, muttering to himself, in search of Tom. I had punctuated his speech with a series of "yes, sir" to help me keep my temper. But 5 minutes after he had gone, I was in a blazing fury. As we completed the move up to our area, I analyzed and reanalyzed the incident, trying to find some justification for this outburst. Remembering how Piccadilly Jim had first created a situation by giving 3 different orders in as many minutes and then come driving down the line as though to gloat over the muddle he had created, and remembering the trouble he had deliberately made with Billy by talking at him in riddles and cursing him for something he had not done, I recalled a good many other little things. Piccadilly Jim seemed to be getting a sort of Agamemnon complex. I wondered if he would soon be punished for hubris. In fact, I think this was the effect the strain of battle had upon him, showing itself in 100 different ways in everyone. In any case, it was still true that as a colonel in action he was successful, and that he had the men's confidence. I decided that if I accepted this rebuke tamely, Piccadilly Jim would despise me. So I wrote him a carefully and officially phrased letter explaining what had happened, and adding that if he still held to the opinion of me he had expressed in front of my driver and gunner, that I was not fit to be a lance corporal, I had better leave the regiment as soon as possible. Meanwhile, I got another driver instead of Moody, and sent him back out of battle. I received a letter from Piccadilly Jim by the hand of my Batman. Dear Keith, it is a great mistake ever to refer to matters which are already forgotten and done with. Napoleon once gave this advice to a friend: never complain. Never explain. I am liberal with my praise, of which you have had your fair share. I am equally outspoken in my criticism, and this you must, I fear, accept. In conclusion, may I recommend to you this advice which Theodore Roosevelt gave to the undergraduates of Harvard: keep your eyes on the stars, but your feet on the ground. I wondered how this specious treatment of awkward situations would satisfy his constituents after the war, and whether he would be able to placate them with a couple of stock quotations. When Raoul had got into trouble once, Piccadilly Jim had used the same one, as from Napoleon, on him. As a subaltern, I had to be satisfied. In any case, the letter dispelled my pique, it amused me, and I knew it had amused Piccadilly Jim to write it. Besides, it was as near an apology as he would go. From our new position, we could see the white houses of Mercer Brego on the skyline northwest of us. In front of us lay a series of false crests, and far away, to the southwest, the long wadi up which the Germans had advanced and beaten back the first British move. We went out on reconnaissance in this area with 2 troops of the Crusader Squadron. Advancing along the southern lip of the valley, I came to a partially burnt-out Humber armored car, and beside it the grave, with a neat painted cross, of a Royal Dragoons Sergeant Major. The tinned rations in the car's ration boxes were a little blackened but made a welcome addition to our stock. A tin of treacle, well heated, contained a delicious black, toffee-like substance. On the northern rim of the valley, at our end of it, a standing patrol of armored cars watched the Italian forward positions across the plateau to the west. The subaltern officer in charge, a boy whose red-brown, peeling face was covered with sores and a slimy ointment, made us crawl up to his observation position. There he had a long telescope mounted on little tees of sand, like those one could look through for a penny at English seaside resorts. In the dial appeared figures moving about, and occasional smears of light sand where there were freshly dug positions from which the soil had not been properly cleared away. Being at an hour's notice, we did not put up our little black tent, which remained back with the B vehicles. The troops of Crusaders stayed hull down to anyone coming from the west, with a lookout per troop all day, and our supporting infantry manned their Vickers machine guns on the flanks. At night, we assembled to drink whiskey and talk. Raoul had joined us again, and was, of course, very indignant to find Tom now the squadron leader. On the second evening, a pleasant, quiet chap, a captain, came to live with us from our new Royal Horse Artillery Regiment. He was to be Ken Tinker's successor, our new observation post officer. His name was Robin. He seemed shy and did not speak much, but Raoul drank too much and began to argue very rudely with everyone. Tom was furious with him, and so was I, for his voice had risen to a loud and hectoring monologue. He made it very difficult for me to defend him against Tom's criticisms. Robin had begun to answer Raoul very calmly and reasonably, without losing his temper, and we were ashamed that Robin should have such a welcome on his first evening with us. Raoul and his troop went off on patrol the next night, and we had a fairly amicable argument about snobbery. When Robin had gone, Tom said, "He's a very good chap, but I suppose it was too much to hope for another Ken." It was plain that we could not expect Robin to supply Ken Tinker's quicksilver dash and brilliance in action. At Mercer Brega began what, looking back, seems the silly season of the campaign, which lasted more or less as far as Tripoli. Piccadilly Jim himself seemed to be showing the strain of action in a disastrous overconfidence, an idea that grew to alarming proportions later, and in time seemed to bring the inevitable judgment of the gods. He could not bear to sit still for long, and chafed, as we all did, while we sat and waited for orders. We had all marked on our maps the enemy positions, and those of our own troops. At last, we heard that the Highlanders were going to move forward and take up a position during the night directly threatening the Italian positions. This, it was pointed out on the maps, was a clever move that would force the Italians either to retire or to fight. But in the morning, after the advance, the Italians, disconcertingly, remained there and did not fight. Now it was rumored that the New Zealanders, with some extra armor, were going under General Freyberg to do a chuck around to the south, through marshy ground which the Germans, not unreasonably, had supposed impassable and had not even patrolled. They were to emerge on the coast at Marble Arch and cut the enemy off. We should then go forward and fight the last battle of the North African campaign, with Rommel encircled. Still, no orders came, and Piccadilly Jim got the brigadier's permission to send out 3 troops of the Crusader squadron on a reconnaissance in force. We were, however, so restricted and cautioned that there was little point in our going at all. On no account were we to lose any tanks. A heavy squadron came somewhere in our wake. What we were to ascertain was never made clear. The armored car standing patrols already knew and had reported far more about the enemy gun positions than we could possibly find out by swanning about, raising clouds of dust in tanks. The battery of 25-pounders had come out behind us in the hope of getting a shoot, but if we were not allowed to take any risks, their shoot would be directed from extreme range. I was ordered to draw the fire of some of these guns while the Royal Horse Artillery Observation Post Officer tried to locate them and bring fire on them. I took my troop out onto the plateau and careered up and down, raising as much dust as possible, while a few big shells bashed up the ground 400 or 500 yards short of us. At last, the 25-pounders went into action, but apparently with no more effect than the enemy. Then the whole squadron, with a couple of infantry carriers, crept along the wadi and moved up onto the plateau again near the enemy guns. This time, their fire was too accurate to be amusing, and the 2 carriers were sent farther forward but came scuttling back after being narrowly missed. The enemy was still well out of range of the tank's guns. Robin could not get his battery into action again, although he came up and sat with us until most of the water cans on the outside of his light American tank were holed by shell fragments. Finding that we did not move any farther forward, the brigadier was getting anxious for our safety. The enemy sent out some small trucks to drive up and down in front of his position, I suppose in the hope of luring us on. But we turned and made for home. Guy, the second in command of the regiment, had been in charge of this abortive expedition. He was older than Piccadilly Jim and had been in the regiment, I think, longer than anyone. He was fantastically rich and handsome, and appeared, as indeed he was, a figure straight out of the 19th century. He was charming and entirely obsolete. His ideas were feudal in the best sense. He regarded everyone in the regiment as his tenants, subtenants, serfs, etc., and felt his responsibilities toward them as a landlord would. Everyone loved him, and I believe pitied him a little. His slim, beautifully clad figure remained among our dirty, greasy uniforms as a symbol of the regiment's former glory. He seldom, if ever, wore a beret. On this particular occasion, I remember he had a flannel shirt and a brown stock pinned with a gold pin, a waistcoat of some sort of yellow suede lined with sheep's wool, beautifully cut, narrow trousers of fawn cavalry twill without turn-ups, and brown suede boots. On his head was a peaked cap with a chinstrap like glass, perched at a jaunty angle. His moustache was an exact replica of those worn by heroes of the Boer War. His blue eye had a courageous twinkle, and he had the slim, strong hands of a mannered horseman. He chafed at having to keep out of the enemy's range when he might have charged the guns in line, and found the matter of writing a report afterward very tedious. When it was done, 6-figure map references and all, he showed it proudly to Tom and said, "Glance over that, will you, Tom? See if it's all in order, you know, and all that." Checking up on the map references, Tom found the actions reported taking place somewhere in the sea off Benghazi. He pointed this out tactfully to Guy, who was quite unabashed, and said, "Oh. Seemed to have got 'em a bit wrong, eh? Well, we put 'em." Soon afterward, Guy was sent off on a long reconnaissance from which no one expected to see him return, for he was not only quite fearless but reckless as well, and would not consider a reconnaissance complete until he had driven over in his jeep and had a look at the enemy's faces. 14. Whether it was the result of this display of force by all arms or not, I do not know, but the enemy withdrew and our infantry followed them up within a day or two. We fought an action, mainly against Italian gunners, before a gala. They fought very bravely, and the crew of one gun allowed Tom's tank to get within 50 yards of them before firing. Unfortunately for them, they missed him, only carrying away the ration boxes on one side of the tank, and he overran the gun, actually crushing one of the crew under the tank. In this action, the medical officer was badly wounded, and for a long time was in danger of losing an arm and a leg. But later we heard that he had managed to keep both, though they would never be 100% useful again. His driver was killed outright. That evening, going into Liga after dark, Raoul, who had just completed his first real day in action since rejoining us, he had little to do on the reconnaissance, had his elbow smashed by a stray shell and was taken away, back to Alexandria, out of the war, having been in action only 3 days and wounded twice. The next day, we began to move across country toward the road. Those of the Italian tanks and guns which we had not destroyed or captured had withdrawn in the night. As we crawled over a rise, the Crusaders, as usual, spread out ahead. We saw the little white village of Agala 3 or 4 miles away across a vast plain. We advanced very slowly across this plain, which was quite devoid of cover, toward the town and the high ridge of ground in front of which the coast road ran. There was no sign of movement from the tiny white squares and the green blobs of scrub shielding them. Coming closer, we could make out the skeletons of aeroplanes scattered on an airfield below the town. If the gunners of the day before had been in position on that far ridge, I do not think we should ever have got across the plain. The low sun of early morning threw our shadows many yards across the ground. But there was no fire. We crawled closer, watching the skyline and the town through our binoculars. Looking to the left, I saw a dark grey blur of smoke, shaped like a tree but many times a tree's height, standing up silently from the ground, like a djinn who had suddenly materialized. The djinn was about a mile away, half left of our line of advance. As I watched, 2 more like him sprang up beside him, just as the first boom of a tremendous explosion reached us, the shock of its blast, even at this distance, smacking me lightly on the cheek. There was always a feeling of the miraculous, of watching a magician's trick, perhaps the Indian rope trick, when the dust of a big explosion leapt silently into the air. Often its dust would blow away before the sound of it reached the ear. We did not find out what these explosions were, there were no more of them, and we crossed the road a little west of the town, the air humming with warnings to beware of mines. But as yet, no mines were discovered. They must have been plentifully sown in the ground we crossed, probably we went over some without exploding them. The water point at Agala was later found to be surrounded with them. From now on, we encountered every kind of mine, booby trap, and explosive charge in the most likely and unlikely places. Some were left hidden, some exposed, some connected so as to involve anyone who set off one in a series of explosions. They were attached to doors, furniture, loot, rubbish, and on one occasion, to the branch of a tree which someone idly pulled in going by. The verges of gaps in the road were mined with anti-personnel and vehicle mines, and mines were sown in the tracks of vehicles, where other vehicles might be expected to follow in the hope of being safe where someone else had gone. There were explosive thermos flasks and fountain pens, presumably manufactured by those firms that in peacetime specialize in joke cigarettes which squirt ink into your face, and stink bombs. We imagined a revision of their usual advertisement, causes howls of pain. Try it on your enemies. During the last mile of our approach to Agala, it became increasingly plain that Piccadilly Jim did not want to bypass the town without officially claiming it as our capture, although it had already been captured by the BBC in the news the night before. This was understandable. There was a good deal of hesitation while he told first my troop, and then finally the carriers, to enter and search the town. The infantry came up on the air an hour or two later to say they had found some Christmas presents, pleasant and unpleasant booty and booby traps. This slight hesitation behind Agala put us behind in the order of regiments moving up the road. Another regiment caught up with the retreating guns and went into action against them without more result than the loss of 4 tanks and the silencing of their supporting 25-pounders by counter-battery fire. We were moved up and sat on another stretch of coastal plain under fire from very heavy guns for a whole afternoon. The silly season continued. One tank could have seen as much as a whole regiment from this position, and if anyone had been killed during that interminable afternoon, he would have died for no reason at all. The bursts of these shells, which luckily were lobbed over very inaccurately, were more like bomb bursts than ordinary shell explosions, and at 50 yards distance would blow in the driver's glass in the Crusader and strip the loose fittings off the outside of the tank. There was an enormous percentage of duds, one of which landed about 10 yards from my tank, splattering us with mud from the rather marshy ground. It was of the caliber of those railed-off specimens in public places, and its tremendously ineffective arrival reminded me of H.M. Bateman's cartoon The Dud, which shows a shell with a face, expressive of gloating anticipation, flying through the air only to fall and bend its nose. It is last seen, on end, in the center of a gaping crowd, oozing amytol tears, very woebegone. I moved the tank to a safe distance and went on eating biscuits and cheese and reading National Velvet. That concludes the 6th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.